Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we are taking on a seriously ambitious goal. We are going to try to shatter the incredibly intuitive assumption that you and I are just independent observers living in a completely separate objective world. Instead, we're going to deconstruct the very architecture of how you perceive reality, and hopefully show you that the world you think you're living in is actually a real-time, co-created masterpiece. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our agenda for today. 1. The illusion of separation. 2. The map is not reality. 3. The coevolution of reality. 4. The centerless karmic cycle. And 5. Pointing at the moon. You can totally think of this agenda as our literal map for today's journey, but consider yourself warned right up front. The map is absolutely not the territory. Section 1. The illusion of separation and the dualistic glitch in our operating system. Right now, just look around the room you're sitting in. Notice how undeniable that feeling of solid, independent boundaries actually feels. But I really have to ask you, where is the absolute boundary between you and the world? We navigate our lives completely relying on this subject-object dualism. Think about a security camera bolted to the side of a brick building. We just assume the camera is this independent perceiver, right? And the parking lot is the perceived world, just sitting out there objectively. We assume there's a strict mechanical transfer of data from an inherently existing outside world straight into an inherently existing receiving instrument. Well, this is what ancient philosophers actually called the TRIAD of Delusion. We falsely chop a unified, centerless process into 3 really rigid, independent building blocks. First, we think we are a solid perceiver, kind of like a little pilot sitting in a theater behind our own eyes. Second, we think perception is this independent beam traveling out from us. And third, we think the perceived is just a static external world. We literally violently divide the observer from the observed, treating the whole universe like a giant bucket of isolated cosmic Lego bricks. Let's move to Section 2. The map is not reality, and escaping the disease of cartographic reification. So what if I told you that the solid world we just analyzed is entirely a cognitive fabrication? The sources we're looking at call this the disease of reification. Cartographic reification is basically the cognitive error of forcefully treating an abstract conceptual model, our mental map, which is made entirely of our own biases and conditioning, as if it were a concrete, independent physical thing. And yeah, for sure, we use these dualistic maps to build bridges and avoid traffic, so they are conventionally useful. But the trap is we forget our concepts are just mental shorthand. We mistakenly assume the map is the territory. And why do we do this? Well, it's actually a biological glitch. It really comes down to edge detection. Tens of thousands of years ago, out on the savannah, your ancestors had to instantly draw a hard boundary between a predator and the tall grass just to survive. But this ruthless survival software kind of went into overdrive. We basically took a biological tool meant for spotting tigers, and we turned it into our entire philosophical foundation for the universe, which forces a beautifully fluid universe into rigid artificial boxes. Section 3. The coevolution of reality and the instantaneous feedback loop of experience. Now, you might be wondering, if the world isn't just a bucket of isolated Lego bricks, what exactly is it? Underneath all our conceptual models is a relational web called dependent origination, and here is a massive paradigm shift. The concept that the map is not the territory is strictly equivalent to the coevolution of the perceiver and the perceived. The observed reality is entirely made of our own bias, our conditioning, and our models. They're dependently co-arisen. The observer and the observed models condition each other in real time. They don't exist independently at all. They co-evolve. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. Think about a parent and a child. A man standing in a room just cannot be a father all by himself, in a vacuum, right? The specific identity of the parent only blinks into existence the exact millisecond the child takes its first breath. One doesn't linearly cause the other. They define each other instantaneously. And this completely destroys the idea of linear causality. Subjects and objects co-create each other the exact microscopic millisecond that they interact. Let's ground this with what we can call a real-time karmic loop. Imagine someone who was bitten by a dog as a kid, walking down a sidewalk and suddenly seeing a golden retriever. That past trauma, their biological karma, already primes their nervous system. So when they look at the dog, their mind reflexively projects a severe threat onto the animal. The perceived threat instantly spikes their heart rate, which then immediately rewires the observer's internal state for the very next second. The dog isn't inherently terrifying. The conditioned observer and the visual trigger co-create a terrifying reality in a microsecond feedback loop.
So the boundary between internal and external, it's a complete illusion. It's entirely porous. The observer and the observed, the very models and maps we use to navigate, are conditioning each other in real time. The environment creates the mind exactly as the mind simultaneously shapes the environment.
Section 4, the centerless karmic cycle. Reality as a constantly updating process. Because if the observer and the observed are constantly co-evolving, we really have to abandon the search for an origin point. Look at the metaphor of the shadow and the light source. We have this deep-seated belief that our self is this permanent entity, just waiting in the dark behind our eyes for experiences to happen to it. But a shadow doesn't just sit in a dark room waiting for a light to turn on, does it? The shadow is an event. It's instantaneously co-created by the interaction of the light and the object. If the light moves, the shadow updates instantly. You are not a permanent mannequin. You are an event, constantly dismantled and reassembled by your interactions. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that reality is a real-time holographic feedback loop where the observer and the observed instantaneously co-create each other. This is the limitless, centerless, fractal karmic cycle. The conventional world we see, the traffic jams, the coffee cups, the broken noses, they are all real, but they just don't exist the way our edge-detecting brains think they do. They are incredibly useful illusions, a co-created dance. Which brings us to Section 5, pointing at the moon, relinquishing the ultimate map.
Now, when we deconstruct the solid world like this, the human mind desperately tries to grab onto these new philosophical concepts, words like emptiness or the karmic cycle, and turn them into our new absolute territory. But here's the catch. Even emptiness is just a map. It's an interdependent tool. It's a conceptual eraser designed just to cure us of our map clinging. It is not some magical void hiding behind reality. The actual territory, which ancient texts call suchness or tathata, is beyond all models and all maps. It is an unconstructed, indescribable, tranquil flux.
Now, what's really interesting about this is a famous ancient quote. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. That centerless karmic cycle we just spent all this time explaining, that is just a metamap. It's another finger pointing at the moon. True liberation isn't about perfectly memorizing the ultimate philosophical map. It's about putting down the flawed expectation that any conceptual map can ever hold reality. It's navigating the conventional world skillfully, but knowing that the code is, at the end of the day, just code. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Think about the biggest stressor in your life right now. How much of your deep anxiety and suffering is simply the immense, exhausting friction of trying to forcibly freeze a fluid, centerless cycle? What would actually happen if you just put down the heavy burden of that invisible mannequin, stopped desperately trying to freeze the river of reality, and simply allowed yourself to rest in the limitless, centerless dance of existence? The map is not the territory. Keep questioning the map. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer,